Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing this morning? All right, on. Hey, for those who caught the keynote speaker yesterday, pretty awesome, huh? I thought that was great. My name is David Amami. I'm from the city of Happy Valley, and I'm also a League of Oregon Cities board member. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We have a great panel today, and I'm going to introduce our facilitator today, who I just want to say spent a lot of time putting this together and helping organize this and bring all this, talent here in one room. And so please join me in welcoming my dear friend, Oregon City Mayor Denise McGriff.
Good morning. Oh, we can do better than that. We in church. Good morning.
Good morning.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David, for that very kind introduction. But as you know, nothing gets done without the participation of many people. And I have Lisa Trevino to thank for helping this. And the idea originally came about a year ago from the People of Color Caucus, and I just decided to take the bull by the horns and make sure this happened this time. So I'm very excited to be able to have this happen. So many of you know we have 9 federally recognized tribes and many other tribal members in our state that are not recognized, which I don't understand. That's a whole nother story, why they're not. But and many of us have no or little experience about how to work with other governments. And they are indeed government to government, just like we are. I have the pleasure of facilitating meetings on a regular basis with the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. I also have been working with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. If you were in the session earlier, medium cities, I talked about the Cayuse 5 Memorial that we are working with both of those tribal governments on a reconciliation and healing. Oregon City issued an apology about the incident that happened in 1850, and we're looking forward to phase 2. But let's get on with the show. So participants, as you know, will explore the effective strategies for building meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities. And we have 3 amazing people here who I spent some time on the phone with saying, would you please work with us on this? So I am going to start with Patrick Flanagan, and he is the Executive Director of the Office of Legislative Commission on Indian Services. It is a 13-member commission that was created in 1975 to improve services for Indigenous peoples in Oregon, and he can say more about his background if he chooses to. Next is Anthony Broadman, is currently on the Bend City Council and has served since 2022, and I believe you are running for State Senate, is that correct? And he is an attorney specializing in representing tribal governments and advancing Indigenous rights in state and federal courts. And last but not least is my dear friend, Representative Anessa Hartman, District 40, my state representative. And Anessa is the member of, I'm going to try this because I said I would. She is a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of the Cayuga Nation Snipe Clan, and she brings a wealth of experience in advocating for Indigenous voices and fostering equitable policies. She is the 3rd Indigenous person elected to the Oregon legislature, and Anessa's work focuses on child care, increased tribal representation in government at all levels, and she also has been our champion and advocate against I-205 tolling, if I may get a shameless plug in there. And Anessa also served, we first met in 2019 when Councilor Amami and Councilor Hartman and I were all elected to our respective city councils, and we have been fast friends since then. She currently serves as a community wealth building manager at NEA in Portland. Which one of you would like to go first? Is Anessa, are you going first? No, I mean, you can go with however you want. So we're going to have sort of a little bit of a broad overview to set the context for this event. And do the mics work?
Yes.
Okay, and then you can hand it off to who's going next. We're doing it a little free form, but anyway, thank you so much for being here on this, to work with us and talk with us on this very, very important topic.
All right, everybody. Good morning. This is very exciting. Yes. Again, my name's Vanessa Hartman. I'm so excited to be up here with you all today. Patrick Flanagan and I are going to sort of tag team the first part of this when we talk about government-to-government relations with tribes. As Mayor McGriff mentioned, we pronounced it very well, Haudenosaunee people. It's more commonly known as the Six Nations of Iroquois, but that was our French given name. Haudenosaunee Confederacy is our name, and we are a matriarchal society, so we follow our mother's bloodline. So my grandmother and my mom are all Cayuga Nation, and I will carry that on. And my grandfather was Seneca Nation. I have had the privilege of being state representative for the past 22 months, not that I'm counting, but it has been a wonderful 22 months, really building all these connections. And I was reflecting on the way over here that 2 years ago, maybe not to the day, but the last time we had the LOC conference, when I was still a city councilor, we got to read the land acknowledgement for the first time, and I think that was really amazing that we did that. And I see some of my other People of Color Caucus members here, and I'm just honored that, Denise, that you and others advocated to have this conversation, because it is extremely important for us to do this. So I will hand it over kind of to you. You want to? Yes?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Again, Patrick Flanagan, Executive Director, Legislative Commission on Indian Services. Hopefully, these materials will be useful here. Full confession, I found out I was going to be sitting up here day before yesterday and put this PowerPoint together yesterday. And the materials are kind of pulled from two different training sessions that I did most recently with LPRO, Legislative Policy and Research Office in Salem. But those were two 90-minute sessions, and so we've tried to distill those slides down to about 15 or 20 minutes here. I am hoping that these will be available to all of you, because there are a few slides that are in here that are only in here for your later reference. They have hot links in them where you can pull up documents and other materials that are supporting. We won't talk too much about them here, but I thought it was important to include them. I also thought it was important to start off with some fundamentals, because it's amazing to me that I've been in this role for about 3 years now at the Commission on Indian Services, and prior to that, I spent 11 years at the Oregon Department of Justice, where I headed up environmental crimes and cultural resource prosecutions. But in this role at LCIS, I am constantly reminded how little we know, how little we have been exposed to through our educational processes, through the school systems and whatnot, when it comes to history of Oregon and history of tribes in Oregon. So I think it's really important that we start these conversations not assuming anything. For some of you, this will be very, very familiar, and for some of you, it may be new. Because of the limited time we have, you hear people talking about approaching it from a 30,000-foot level or a 60,000-foot level. This might be the view if you're at the space station and trying to look down to Earth. That's how superficial we'll have to be. But it is important to recognize that tribes, Indian tribes, are unique legal entities in the United States that have distinct political communities, and they have the ability to self-govern. Also important to remember, and perhaps most important to remember, this tribal sovereignty predates the United States. In other words, sovereignty wasn't given to the tribes. The tribes were sovereign before they engaged in treaties and whatnot. Thank you. It's interesting, it is a paradigm shift, because so often we think of what the United States gave to the tribes through these treaties and through this relationship, and it is important to remember it's actually the other way around. The tribes had these rights and these abilities before the United States got here. And that even goes to the terminology of reservations. We think of reservations as something that was given to the tribes through treaties, but if you think about the word itself, reserved, that's land that was reserved by the tribes. It was already theirs. It was all that they were able to retain after they gave up the rest of their lands. But we'll get more into that. The United States Constitution does consider tribes as separate governments. Treaties, importantly, are between the United States and the tribes. those treaties predate statehood in most cases. And in general, in the Pacific Northwest, most of the treaties that exist both in Oregon and Washington are kind of loosely referred to as Palmer and Stevens treaties. They were the Indian agents that were in the area at the time. And you'll find substantial similarities in the language of the treaties because even though computers didn't exist, apparently cut and paste did. And they're very, very similar. In those treaties, tribes ceded almost all of their lands to the federal government in exchange for small parcels, which are what we just talked about as reservations, and various promises. Those promises are what we refer to today as trust responsibilities, and make no mistake, trust does not mean I trust you, you trust me. Trust is an obligation of a trustee and a trustor, an obligation that the United States has towards the tribes. This is another slide that was kind of a slap in the face for me when I first heard it. I was at AT&I conference a couple of years ago, and there was an individual up on a panel from the Army Corps of Engineers, and he was being asked about sovereignty and consultation and what sovereignty was in his mind. He was not a tribal member, but was presenting at the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians conference. And he was kind of taken aback by the question on how, what sovereignty meant and how important it was, because he said, look, Article 6 of the United States Constitution says that all treaties made are the supreme law of the land. I mean, that kind of really sets the framework of how important treaties are and the status that the United States has in relationship to the tribes. If you stop and think about the whole concept, a party enters into a treaty with another party because they are considering them or approaching them as equals. In other words, if the province of Alberta had a dispute with the United States wouldn't enter into a treaty with the province of Alberta. They enter into a treaty with Canada, right? The United States, therefore, in entering into treaties with tribes, was treating them as equals. And I think that's an important concept to think about when we think about government-to-government interaction, government-to-government relations, because arguably, at the state level, I can tell you on a practical level, when we talk about government-to-government relations between the state and the tribes, frequently we talk about directors of agencies having correspondence directly with tribal chairs. Well, that's not government-to-government. It's certainly not on par. The director of DEQ or ODOT is not on par with the chair of a tribe, right? Arguably, even the governor isn't on par. If the United States is entering into treaties with tribes, that kind of tells you the parity that should exist. Now, I want to be careful with that because there's practical realities too, right? And we can't be having the United States engaging in every discussion with the tribes as to what is happening in the state of Oregon. And even the governor can't be engaged in all of those consultations, those government-to-government interactions. So there's some practical realities, but I do think it does set the stage for how we should be thinking about tribes in the state and the significance that they have and the role that they play. So if we were talking about the space station view, we just talked about treaties, and now we're going to talk about assimilation and termination. And really briefly, you'll hear some of this terminology because you'll hear about terminated tribes, and then the next slide is restored tribes. But in the 1940s, generally in the 1950s, the passage of the Western Oregon Indian Termination Act ended the federal government's trust relationship with 61 Oregon tribes, primarily west of the Cascade Mountains. We could go into a very lengthy discussion about the purpose of termination, the intent of termination. It may come as no surprise to you that the terminated tribes also, perhaps not coincidentally, had tremendous natural resources, timber and whatnot on their lands. When termination occurred, that federal trust relationship, those treaties were effectively nullified. And to put it more simply, really, there was also a movement of, and I know this sounds kind of flippant, but in DC, there was this notion of, this whole treaty trust relationship thing, that hasn't worked out so well. We're all Americans. Let's all just be Americans. And so they terminated the tribes and just assimilated the tribes in theory. but in doing so took those lands that had been reserved and then dispersed the lands to tribal members on occasion, but also to other individuals or business entities or whatever, because those lands were now just part of the United States. Make no mistake, all of the obligations that existed in that trust relationship, all of those promises, those now became the responsibility of the tribes, and there was no funding that came along with that to enable the tribes to create health services and provide educational opportunities and things of that nature.
Before we move on to the next slide, I think one piece to be very clear about this Assimilation and Termination Acts is that assimilation and termination didn't begin in the 40s and the 50s, and I think I want to be really clear, like this is important information to have. But who in here knows what a boarding or residential school is, or was? Oh, this is great. So when that happened, both in the Canadian government and in the United States, I think it's important that I always share that this isn't generations that we're talking about 4 generations ago or 3 generations ago. My grandparents, if they were still alive, would be in their 80s. Both were forced to go to residential school, to one of the more infamous residential schools, because it didn't close its doors until 1996. 1996. It was the Mohawk Institute. Both my grandparents and the older 2 aunts were forced to go, and this is why my grandparents moved my entire family off reservation and into the States, because of this particular school. And the impacts that it had on my family and other families around disconnecting ourselves from culture is so key, because I'm 36. This is not something that happened a really long time ago, and so the impacts are still continuing today. And so I want to make sure we focus on that piece, because while this starts in the 40s and 50s here, there were attempts at many times, including the Dawes Act, before this, that attempted to basically erase, or the phrase was "kill the Indian, save the man," and that was the intent. And I think it is also important, I can't remember the quote off the top of my head, but when this was being enacted, Native people don't ever look at the fact that they own a land. We are stewards of the land for the next 7 generations. Their goal, the government's goal, was to teach the Indian man to prize this as a possession so that they will become greedy, because that's not something that Native people were originally like. If you need something, we give it to you. It's not, it wasn't sort of in our mentality. And so including in a part of this is really, how do we teach them to be self-sufficient or think in an individualistic way, so that they no longer have their community around them to fight us, and so we can take more of their land. So I know this is a space station view, but when it comes to the assimilation and termination, I mean, it's still to today, we had the 60 scoop, if you're not familiar, where, child welfare, CPS coming around and taking Indian children away. We had forced sterilization. So there's a lot that has happened up until very recently that continues to reduce the population size. So I just wanted to add that piece there.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. And I want you all to realize how fortunate we are to have Representative Hartman provide that perspective. I mentioned that these slides came from 2 training sessions that I'd done, and I'm frequently asked to go to training on this subject. Again, my name is Patrick Flanagan. It's not difficult to ascertain my ancestry, and no matter how hard I try, I do not have the tribal perspective, right? I was not raised in that cultural paradigm. That is not part of my ancestry, part of my history. I've been extremely, extremely fortunate to be given this opportunity to work with the tribes in this capacity, and I've been welcomed in many and most instances in that regard, but no matter how hard I try, I will never have that personal perspective. And so I'm actually relieved to have Representative Hartman here to be able to provide that perspective to you. That being said, I also want to remind all of you that I do not speak for the tribes. I am the director of the Commission on Indian Services and that body, but I do not, and nor will I ever, speak for the tribes collectively or any tribe individually. So it was a good time for me to throw that legal disclaimer in.
Moving along so we can get to the premise of the session, which is respectful communication, understanding tribal priorities, and how we engage in collaborative projects.
Thank you, Mayor McGriff. It's very important that we set the stage for those who don't understand even the basics of the history. So.
And I think we're going to be getting onto that right after these two slides, but I think it's important to have these two slides in here. And this was a realization for me. There's a 10-part video series that's out now and available through the LCIS website and through various other state agency websites, Oregon Department of Education, but there were 10 parts that were done, 9 of which are interviews with tribal representatives that give them the opportunity to talk about sovereignty and consultation and what it means to them. And one phrase that Chair Mead, chair of the Coquille tribe, utilized is she said, if you're going to be doing anything on tribal lands, you need to be talking to us. And that's an interesting statement in and of itself, because you have to stop and think, well, what do we mean when we say tribal lands? And I have this map and the next map are the Warm Springs, because they're two good examples of how there could be different meaning or intentions behind tribal lands. The slide on the left, these both came from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation website. The slide on the left is probably what most of us think of when we think of tribal lands. The dark green are the reserved lands, and the lighter green are the lands that were ceded under their treaty, right? So that was the federal government's view of the Umatilla tribal lands at the time, the lighter green. But the slide on the right is their traditional use area, right? Which is obviously significantly bigger than even the light green, the ceded lands, what the United States said were the lands of the tribes. We can see a similar paradigm when we look at the Warm Springs tribe. Again, the left-hand side is the reserved lands, the outline is the ceded lands, and the right-hand slide is the traditional use areas. So you have to even pause when a tribal member says, if you are contemplating action on tribal lands, recognize we're not talking about the Rand McNally Atlas version of tribal lands where you open up the map and you see the little green dot. We're not even talking about the ceded lands, which are significantly larger in what the federal government said the tribes had. When the tribes say, when you're taking action on tribal lands, talk to us, they're talking about their traditional use areas. So that phrase in and of itself is a lot more loaded than might be apparent on its face. So briefly, from the legal standpoint, you noticed, the 1970s was restoration, and coincidentally, in the 1970s or not, the Commission on Indian Services was formed. It was formed to kind of create that nexus between the state and the tribes, and the ability to address issues of concern to the tribes and of mutual concern between the tribes and the state. Next year is 50 years for the Commission on Indian Services. And one thing to note is we are the only state in the country that has a legislative commission on Indian services. In every other state, this position, my position, would be counsel to the governor. The legislature in the 1970s decided to put this office in the legislative branch because we are nonpartisan, we're apolitical, and we are somewhat immune from the winds of change that happen with every election cycle. My predecessor was in this role for 26 years, and you're not going to get that kind of continuity if the position is within the office of the governor, because you will have changes in administration. As mentioned, there are 14 members. There's one member of the commission from each of the 9 tribes. The tribes appoint that member, and then there are 4 legislative members, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, a Republican and Democrat each, hence the apolitical, nonpartisan nature of the commission. Now, the gut of this, when we talk about government-to-government relations, and this is the state paradigm, recognizing that there are cities, counties, municipalities present and represented in the room. The state paradigm is on top of that approach that created the Commission on Indian Services, which was indicative of the importance that the state places upon government-to-government relations with the tribes. That relationship in itself was formalized. Frequently you'll hear reference to Senate Bill 770. It always makes me cringe as a lawyer when people reference efforts and initiatives by Senate Bill number, because as you all know, which Senate Bill 770? But I can assure you, when you're talking to tribes, there's only one Senate Bill 770 that we're talking about, and that became ORS 182-164. State agencies shall develop and implement policies that identify individuals in the agency who are responsible, tribal liaisons, establish a process to identify programs, promote communication between the agency and the tribes, positive government-to-government relations, various other requirements. And so why does the state engage in consultation? 182, 164 says it's the law. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because it reads, a state agency shall make a reasonable effort to cooperate with tribes in the development and implementation of programs of the state agency that affect tribes. Well, even that phrase is more loaded than you would think, because the assumption has long been, state agency means, oh, DEQ, ODOT, Department of State Lands, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, state agency. Well, that statute also defines state agency. And like any good lawyer, you're not going to just give the definition right there. You're going to send them to a different statutory section that has absolutely nothing to do with this statutory section. So we're going to send you to 358-635. But state agency includes all officers, employees, agencies, boards, committees, and commissions of the legislative, executive, administrative, and judicial branches of state government. Whenever I mention that to anybody in the state, I've thrown down the gauntlet and nobody's picked it up. I want to know who is a state employee that this doesn't apply to. When it says all officers, et cetera, of the executive, legislative, executive, administrative, and judicial branches, that's kind of everybody. There really isn't anyone that obligation extends to. And I think that's kind of a relatively new realization, even within the legislative branch. There's been a lot of training in the last couple of years with our legislators that, yeah, this applies to you too. So that's the breadth of the obligation. Okay. These are two slides we can rip through, because these are the ones I was talking about that give those references to other guidance documents, the federal guidance documents that exist. But I would argue that it's not only required by law, it's also just the right thing to do. We're living in community. Everyone within the state, including the tribes. And if we want to have the best result that we can get on whatever it is that we're working on, whatever initiative it is, we want to have the perspectives and voices of all people involved and all people who will be impacted. Consultation leads to better collaboration, better and more informed decision-making, gets a better result. And probably equally important for many of you in the room, it helps avoid litigation, right? That's the practical reality. And I just say, kind of in closing, think of it in terms of diplomacy. You need to develop and maintain relationship with tribes before there's a need or a crisis. A firm foundation is essential, and that just gives room for forgiveness when missteps occur, because they will occur. And just by way of quick analogy, I've seen instances where agencies have found themselves at odds with tribes. And there's one instance I can think of not that long ago. And it had to do with a casino in Grants Pass, the Flying Lark. And the Oregon Racing Commission was contemplating an application. And I'd had conversations with folks at the Oregon Racing Commission, and they said, hey, we never engaged in consultation on this. But they also said, to that effect, we don't have a tribal relations policy, and we don't have a tribal liaison. And so the first interaction that they were having with tribes, there hadn't been any foundation that existed when that interaction occurred. Conversely, I've seen Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife at odds with tribes on many occasions, but they also have a long-standing relationship, and they have an easier time navigating those disputes because they have a relationship that's in place. This kind of just summarizes those same points, I think, but it talks about some of the best practices. Build those relationships early.
Yeah, I think before we hand it over, because I know we're getting close on time before we have Q&A question time, I think what's important is, and why we kind of wanted to set the stage of the history and where we've been and where we are now, is because I have often heard, it's, I sent an email and I never heard back. One email, 5 emails, 1 phone call is not enough. This is hundreds of years of oppression onto our tribal partners and our tribal nations. that relationship is going to take time, like time and trust. And I often have come back to, and I think I saw the mayor of Siletz in here somewhere, right there, that they have a perfect story of how it took decades probably, to rebuild that trust and relationship with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz. And now they work in partnership and in tandem because they've built that trust. But it did not happen in a month, it didn't happen in a year. It took time, and it took that relationship building. And I think as you approach tribes that, like you had mentioned earlier, it's not, just the chair. Again, they go through elections as well. But we really lean into culturally our elders. Our elders are our knowledge keepers, our language keepers. That's where we show our respect, because you win over the ante, you can win over a lot of people, and it's harder than you think. But I think attending their events, listening to their story time, researching about their creation story and their cultural practices, going to their powwow and respecting that space, and getting a better understanding for all of tribal people in the Pacific Northwest will help you on that journey. And just, when you go to another country, you try to research those customs and maybe how to say hello or where the bathroom is or how to get another beer. But we don't drink on the tribes. I mean, let me be clear on that one. but do that. The simple basis of saying how do you say hello or goodbye in your language can go a really long way. And so I just wanted to end this part, and there are really more information on the slides, and I'm sure you'll be getting them, that it just is going to take time, and to be patient and to build that trust, just like you're dating somebody. You want to get to know them, and finding that level of respect for their history and where they have been is key to this piece, because we know how to smell someone fake from a mile away and who's being performative, just being very clear, that there have been broken promises since colonial contact. And so I just want people to leave, at least here, with the idea that there should be patience when trying to rebuild, because they don't owe any of you anything, and it's going to take some time. And I hope that when you do explore this, that you'll think about that and respect those stories. So I think it's your turn, unless you had anything else. No?
How much time do we have, Mayor, before Q&A?
We are
I'll
try to do Q&A about 11:30.
Oh, okay, I can run through mine pretty quickly. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Bend. My name is Anthony Broadman. I'm a Bend City Councilor here, and want to recognize that we are on ceded tribal land, and grateful for all of you being here, invested in this particular topic. I'm speaking for myself only. I represent tribes throughout the West. I'm a tribal court judge. I'm a city councilor. None of these statements reflect the official position of the city or any particular tribe. I'm also not prejudging anything that could come before me as a tribal court judge. The lawyers are laughing. And I'm a governmental lawyer. I just represent tribal governments. I'm not a tribal member, and would never, purport to speak on behalf of a tribe when it comes to culture or history. But this is all I've ever done as a lawyer, is represent tribes. I'm going to skip. These are great slides that you presented, Representative and Patrick. Some of mine will dovetail, and I'll try to move through those as quickly as possible, especially the historical parts. I like this map because land is culture, I think, for all of us. Geography and the territory that we all live on reflects the legal landscape that we all operate within. I like this map because it's not just Oregon, and you can see that these lines don't really mean a lot to a lot of tribes, the lines that we use today and the lines that were used in this map. It's also important to recognize that there's a lot of difference of opinion among our tribal governmental partners in Oregon and Washington about who belongs where, what the lines mean, and I think we just need to be cautious and careful as we work with our governmental partners. I'm going to skip back a little bit before the Western Oregon Termination Act to the Oregon Donation Land Act, which divided Western Oregon and a lot of Oregon into parcels that could be conveyed directly to white males and married women, And the Organ Donation Land Act really, in addition to the treaties, which we see as sort of honoring tribal sovereignty, these were instruments of dispossession and oppression and removal of tribal value and land. They shaped all of our history. These claims happened really quickly, within 5 years, and this was the number one dispossession of tribal land and Indian title. And it led to the treaties. You heard about the Western Oregon Termination Act, which terminated many tribes, not just the 6 tribes who have been restored. It's also important to remember that the Warm Springs, Umatilla, and Burns Paiute were not terminated. And in terms of our work in non-tribal government, dealing with restoration, which I think is our obligation as Oregonians to work towards full restoration in our government-to-government relationship with the tribes, restoration was not complete. What started in the late 70s and 80s didn't fully restore tribes to where they were prior to termination. This is an example of C.T. Cluessey's Restoration Act, under which the state of Oregon still exercises criminal and civil jurisdiction over the reservation. There's 574 tribes today. There's multiple state-recognized tribes. There's a lot of unrecognized tribes. Every tribe is completely different. Every tribe in Oregon is completely different. For the Siletz tribe, their Restoration Act, painfully, I would observe as an outsider, did not grant or restore any hunting, fishing, or trapping right, which is a key part of, again, as an outsider, tribes' connection to the land. And that failure to fully restore all of the usufructuary rights, all of the treaty rights, all of the full criminal and civil jurisdiction of tribes upon restoration is something that as local governments, as state governments, we have an obligation, I think, to continue to work towards full restoration. Like Patrick and Representative Hartman, I used these slides from a different presentation about tribal stewardship, so this slide is not relevant, except for you should all know that tribes engage in a lot of co-stewardship with the federal government and with state agencies. This is important, even though it's from a different presentation. Tribes have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We know that based on history. We know that based on what we've learned from tribes in their tradition of passing along history. But all of the work that we do to, whether that's ODFW entering into a co-stewardship agreement with several Western tribes last year, or the cannabis agreements that have been entered into with tribes, or the regulation of the recognition of tribal criminal jurisdiction post PL 280. I won't dig too deep into PL 280, but all of those examples are examples of contracting that we can do to avoid conflict. I'm going to skip that slide, except for that you should all remember as local governments that there is strong tribal regulatory and criminal jurisdiction, and that is the supreme law of the land, and we as non-tribal governments need to honor that. I'm going to skip the federal consultation part because I think we referred to it a little bit in the last set of slides, except for to say that the relationship between the United States and tribes is different than the relationship between the state of Oregon and tribes. As Patrick said, the United States has a trust obligation, a fiduciary obligation to tribes. The state just must not violate treaties, and we have a moral obligation, but the trust obligation is a higher one, and one that is the subject of a lot of litigation. Federal consultation, I'll skip. I'm going to skip most of this because Patrick did such an excellent job. I will say ORS 182-168 remains concerning to me. And that is really, from the beginning, Senate Bill 770 has not had teeth. And it can be violated by any state officer, and there's very little that tribes can do about it. I personally, not representing any tribe, believe that there's an administrative Procedures Act requirement to fulfill the promise of Senate Bill 770, the Oregon Department of Justice disagrees with me. And often these obligations are ignored, and then we hire lawyers. ORS 190, 110 is a really important provision that comes up frequently in my practice representing tribes in connection with local governments. And that is just making clear that tribes can contract with local governments, and that those agreements are important ways of working together. The city of Bend in March entered into an MOU with the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, something I know, I see the mayor here and our city manager, something I know we at the city are really proud of. And it was really important that it not be simply a symbolic agreement, but it has defined obligations for the city of Bend and the leadership of Warm Springs to work together on issues of mutual concern. Our water is, water is life, as I've been taught by my tribal clients, and that's a matter that we need to work on together, especially here in the Deschutes Basin. Cultural resource protection as we grow sustainably, and regional economic development are set out in that agreement, which I'm really proud of. So why agree? Rep. Hartman and Patrick touched on this, but it is so much better to have diplomatic relations with tribal governments than what we've had in our history. Here's a case from 1886, which has this often used quote that states and local governments are the deadliest enemies of tribes, and it was true. And now I would observe that legal scholarship recognizes that there's a new political relationship between tribes and local governments that's really valuable for both governments. There's also to go back to sort of a more granular level on sovereignty, there are a lot of things that local governments need from tribes and can't accomplish because tribes have sovereignty. And when there are intergovernmental needs, whether it's public safety or natural resources, local governments have to come to the table. And tribes have bargaining power in that regard to make sure that they're providing for their people and their future. And I also would like to end with the supremacy clause, because I think it's worth probably saying twice. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. They are above Oregon law and our federalist system. They are above United States code. They are the supreme law of the land, and states must follow them. Local governments must follow them, and we are all bound. Indian law is American law, and something that we all need to observe. Questions?
Well, thank you for that fabulous overview and introduction. And so now we'd like to take some questions. And Lisa has the mic. Do you want to use one of these as well? Okay. So it would be really helpful if you would speak into the mic, say your first name and the city you're with, and also if you have any relationship with any of the tribes in your area. If you don't, that's okay. So go right ahead.
I'm Lily from Gold Hill. Thanks for being here. One thing I've observed in Oregon is that city managers and city councilors transition frequently. And there's not a lot of continuity necessarily between our governments and then the tribal relationships. So as somebody new coming into a new community, how would you suggest you build that relationship if you don't have the institutional knowledge of who to reach out to and how to make those connections, especially when in my current community is an original village location of a tribe and it's so needed to be acknowledged and building that relationship. So for many of us that transition a lot, where do you start?
I guess I'll give you the official answer to that, or the state government answer to that. I would say one place you can come is us. One of the last slides in the Legislative Commission on Indian Services is what we can do for you. And one of the things that we do at the commission, we maintain a website, and that website has all of the contact information for the tribes, for specific tribal representatives. One of the tabs on there says 9 Tribes of Oregon, and if you drop down, it lists each tribe, and then the right-hand column will tell you who the tribal chair is, who their executive officers are. It also gives you any position, title. If they have a natural resources director, it provides that name. But at least we can set you in the right direction, and we field calls like that all the time. I've had calls with Lane County Board of Commissioners. Anthony and I have had conversations on matters pertinent to Bend, and even the memorandum that he mentioned. Not saying that the commission played any role in that memorandum, but just having conversations about the implications and the direction that is going. So we are happy to field those calls and those inquiries and try to help provide guidance on who specifically to reach out to and how that outreach should start and what it should look like. So that's one place to start for sure.
And I would encourage people to use agreements, because agreements survive politicians, right? And it's really important that the relationships, when we build them, that they are durable and they're meaningful and they're not just symbolic. They require us to do things. I will also just give you a caveat that tribal governments get Dear Tribal Leader letters, dozens of Dear Tribal Leader letters a day. DTLL, there's like even an acronym for them. So like, just back to Representative Hartman's point, just because you've sent 5 emails or you've asked 5 times, that's not enough. And I mean, with all tribal governments, it often should start at the staff level so that staff can talk to tribal staff and gain an understanding of what a particular tribe wants. Do they want government to government, or do they just want, staff to work on an issue of energy development or public safety or taxation? Not every issue has to be full-blown tribal consultation. And I recognize that that's challenging for local government. It can be really challenging.
I think to add on from a less government attorney lawyer statement, no offense to you both, I'm just kidding. No. And I mean, it's challenging, right? Like you mentioned, you have a potential historical site from a village. Sadly, a lot of the way we pass down knowledge was through storytelling, not necessarily through writing down. And in the location that you are in, there might be a lot of interaction from now California tribes, Idaho tribes, like just depending on their, as you saw on those maps. And so to your point of being like careful around outreach, I think it's always important to reach out to as many kind of surrounding tribes, and yes to the staff piece, to really finding out who within there. And I don't often say go to a lobbyist, but in this particular case, most of our federally recognized tribes have a lobbyist that has been with them for quite a while, knows their history, knows their interests. For this case, maybe an option to reach out and say, hey, this is what we're thinking, and might be a first step. But I think when it comes to finding lands like that, in your particular case, you better be ready to not give that land back per se, but to be ready to tell the story of whoever says that this is their part of their ancestral land, because we were pretty migratory in the Pacific Northwest, like moving around with the seasons and the fish. And so I think being truthfully honest, what we happened at the Falls is a historical, Willamette Falls is a historical site for many nations, not just Grand Ronde, not just Warm Springs, Yakima Nation, Nez Perce, a lot of different folks. And so I think being mindful that we don't have a ton of written down history, that you might step into a space, and if you're unwilling to fully listen and engage meaningfully, then I would caution stepping outside, building that relationship, because then once you get down the road, there's an opportunity for, again, broken trust. Why did you reach out to us in the first place, right? So stepping into the space, knowing that you want to recognize all history within that area is key, especially when you have a site like that, because what will happen is one tribe might try to claim over another, which ancestrally, that's just not the case. So I think just be wary and be mindful of that piece, speaking very truthfully. But I think some of this that my colleagues up here had mentioned with the staff and then going to your office is a good place to start.
Lisa, I saw Councilor Baumgartner had her hand up next. My colleague.
Hi, I'm Mary Baumgartner. I am City Council President from West Lynn, and very happily colleagues with the Mayor McGriff in Oregon City on matters relating to Willamette Falls. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with something that I wish wasn't the preeminent importance often, but that is legal requirements. So if cities have taken the initiative to undertake relations, that's great, but are there any legal requirements for responsibilities? And should that be legislatively considered? Is this just a huge can of worms? So that is my question, although I have so many others.
I'm not offering you any legal advice. But
No obligation here. So.
yeah, but I will say, I mean, there's many legal obligations that fall on cities. I mean, the topic we were just talking about, NAGPRA, burial protections, cultural resource protections, those all apply to cities. Is there a Senate Bill 770 that applies to cities? I'll leave that up to city lawyers to tell you the answer to that. I think probably not. But we are all, like, to illustrate the point, we are all subject to the supremacy clause when it comes to treaties. And under the Muckleshoot case from the Ninth Circuit, that's been held to counties and cities, even though they weren't parties to those treaties, right? You can't go out and violate a treaty. I don't know the answer of whether or not that counsels for the legislature to step in. I think that that's a question for tribes.
But we did last year with the burial thing,
Right.
at least with the partial body parts being able to be buried for certain
let's
purposes.
Right.
Make sure that
Yeah.
we're going to respond, that you get on the mic so everybody can hear you and it gets picked up for the recording.
Yeah, there have been legislative. The legislature has weighed in particular areas. But I think I thought maybe the question was, do we need a Senate Bill 770 for cities? And I think the answer to that is Senate Bill 182-164 is really hard to work in for everybody. I'm not being critical of it, but the idea of expanding that beyond every single state officer is a question for tribes, for the 9 tribes.
And I think it kind of gets to some of the latter slides that I had where we talked about the legal obligations, but we also talked about just doing the right thing. We can get bogged down in the discussion as to what is legally obligated and legally required. And like any good lawyer, the answer is going to be, it depends, which doesn't help you much because it's always going to depend and it's going to change with every specific instance that you can think of and that will come up. But if you just engage in the process more from the perspective of establishing those diplomatic relations and doing the right thing for any number of reasons, then we don't have to worry about the obligations to do so. You're right, that final section in Senate Bill 770 or S-182 that says that failure to do any of the above does not constitute a separate legal cause of action is problematic. I mean, what that tells us is that's all aspirational. It's telling us this is a good idea, but there's no consequences if you don't. And so there are discussions around that, but those are complicated discussions as well, because if you're going to require something to happen and there are going to be legal ramifications for it not happening, you need to make it clear what needs to happen, when it needs to happen, how it needs to happen, right? So that is a very complicated question and involved discussion. There is a task force that's been convened. As of last session, Representative Sanchez sponsored a bill, and there is a tribal consultation task force that is currently meeting and talking about all of these questions. What should consultation look like, and can we get sufficient clarity that there can also be some level of review or challenge if it doesn't happen? But those are two very big, inextricably intertwined questions, but are both very difficult to answer in their own right.
Lisa, you have the next person.
Hi, I'm Riley Hoagland from the city of Lincoln City, and we work a lot of times with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. And I've done a lot of personal research because it doesn't seem like there's a lot out there. and the reading and first-hand accounts of where wars were or burial grounds, and then we have development or we're going to take over parks or something, and there's a lot of concern of like, is this a burial ground and then, or is it a tribal use? And so there's been a lot of times where the assessments that were done in the 70s to determine whether or not these were significantly cultured lands, that assessment was, it kind of seems like it's been a one and done, and that it wasn't determined in 75, so we don't really need to go back to it. And there's not been a lot of energy towards recognizing, you know, significant battles or burial grounds and things like that. And there's another part to this. So is there other parts of the state that are looking towards that, or is it maybe perhaps it's a Confederated Tribes of Siletz that don't really want that because of grave robbing or something like that? I'm not quite sure why there isn't a lot of awareness to that. And then to speak to specifically to the Siletz tribe of how to engage in activities that would help them, or, you know, for the tribal rights of the fishing, hunting, and things like that. So I just don't know if it's just like, it depends, right? That's the tribe, if they want, they don't, or do want, or, and things like that. But it seems as though there's just like a kind of a hard stop of that awareness.
I know there was a question in there somewhere.
That was a lot.
I know.
I don't know if we can answer that in 3 minutes. I mean, speaking bluntly, there are a lot of lands that are owned by Parks and Rec and the state lands that are owned that I am aware of many sites that the state owns that is not public. And they, for lack of better phrase, who knows if they're unwilling to give them back to the tribes. I think that this is where representation matters, where you have someone maybe like me who wants to fight for that and create policy to require that conversation, because otherwise it's just out of sight, out of mind. We don't need to do that. No one else is fighting for it. And honestly, you know, I don't speak for the tribes at all. I speak individually, but there have been many cases across the country, and I'm assuming here as well, where they would engage in that conversation, and then it ends up just being litigated for years and years and years, and then what is the point? So I think there's not enough of us to advocate for conversations like that yet. It's happening in the building, I think, as you mentioned, Patrick. Like, there's a lot more interest in, like, oh, maybe this is something we really should be caring about. But yeah, I can't speak directly for Siletz by any means.
We have time for one more.
Let's do one more. I don't know who.
Yeah.
We got one here. I don't know who was next.
So while Lisa's finding who was next,
Okay.
I'm Christopher from the city of Philomath, which I think we have relatively positive working relationships with the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon. But I think the overarching question that I think we struggle with is sort of that like dichotomy you mentioned at the beginning, where we have a moral obligation and a desire to consult and to have that relationship, but like you mentioned, we are a small town and a tribe is a sovereign nation. Like, we don't call up Canada to ask them what we should do. And so I think we struggle with that of like, we don't want to bother them, or, you know, like, who am I as a city councilor in this small town to like show up and call up the leader of a sovereign nation to be like, hey, how do you feel about this park? But I know then on the other hand, we should do that. So I guess that I just get stuck in that a lot, where sometimes we hear like, oh no, like tribes don't want to talk to cities. But then we also hear like, well, why didn't you talk to the tribes about this? And it's like, where we want to do the right thing, but it's hard to figure out what is appropriate. And I don't know if there is an answer to that or if that's just the eternal struggle, but I wanted to ask that.
I think, Chris, do you have land in your city? Do you have water in your city? Yes. Do you have trees and animals that run through your city? Like, those things are all equally important to the tribe. And I get that there might be some uncomfortableness of like, I don't want to be disrespectful, but I think just, you know, Siletz, you know, they have their Restoration Day. They have plenty of different, I was going to say festivals, and that is not right. They have different ceremony, and it just takes a going to that to build those connections. But lean into being uncomfortable. You're uncomfortable for a reason. And I think you lean into that and you show that, and that there's some humble and empathy in that. And I wouldn't be afraid to reach out to the tribes, whether it's through their schools or whether it's through other natural resources, and maybe not the council at first, but building that relationship there is key to the next generations that maybe won't feel as uncomfortable to building that, because you make a decision about at any intersection, if you have a river or any sort of land, to us and to them, like, it's all connected. So whatever you put in the river comes down through there, right? And so I think don't be nervous. Get out of your comfort zone, and I think the best place is to go to powwow or to their restoration. Restoration is a huge thing for each tribe that has really beautiful presentations and storytelling. And then there's always the powwow season. Like, there's fry bread and salmon. Like, you gotta go. It's fun. But I don't. I know it's easier for me to say don't feel odd. But I think that there's plenty of opportunity to extend that and build upon that. So
There's never enough time, never enough time. So thank you, speakers. Thank you, Mayor McGriff. Wonderful presentation. I think it's really important in the app, on the LOC app, for those of you who have it on your phones, which I'm sure you all do, it'd be really great if you could leave some feedback. If you'd like to see more sessions like this, or maybe a part 2, or maybe have it be a bit longer, please leave any feedback you have, because I know that this is such an important topic, and I know there were many questions out there, and it's, we really want to make sure we do this justice and don't try to rush through. So I appreciate all of you and everything that you brought to this group today. And we know there's a lot more that we could all be learning. And so thank you so much for your expertise. And thank you once again, Mayor McGriff, for helping to organize this. So next on the agenda, we've got lunch in the exhibit hall. Please make sure to say hi to the vendors. Give them just a minute of your time if you could, because without their sponsorship, events like these wouldn't be possible. And yes. And anyways, I just wanted to say thanks again to everyone for attending the 99th annual LOC conference. And the speakers might be here for another minute if you had a question that you weren't able to ask, so please feel free to stop by for just a couple minutes. And thanks again for coming by. Thanks.